Hello, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is your host, Harry Wilkinson, and this is the show where we take a look at the days and the weeks, events, happenings in the world, politics, international news, technology, the environment, everything that affects us, everything that we hear about, maybe during the course of a week or even a day, whether it be through social media or through more traditional forms of media, from the news outlets, from the radio in your car as you're driving. All of these things affect us. And increasingly, because there's so much of it and so many ways to access it, it is increasingly affecting us. I believe it affects our moods and our sense of well-being and our sense of self, unless it is dealt with in a positive and healthy way. Just like anything else, there's wellness techniques to deal with it. And so, looking at what information we are exposed to from a higher perspective, as the title of our show suggests, is a way that we have to basically deal healthily with some of the things that we are exposed to that might feel a bit toxic from the media and other sources. I started this show about 5 or 6 years ago in a sort of reaction to talk radio and what I was hearing. It really started as far back as I can remember. It kind of started with Rush Limbaugh. And I noticed this change in sort of tone and attitude. Talk radio had always been a place where, these conversations were had, and sometimes they were not always the most pleasant. But there was a real change that I noticed, beginning with Rush Limbaugh, and then there were other people around the same time. This is the early 90s. So there was another radio talk show host, who Laura, I believe her name was, and another kind of sort of very strident, angry kind of voice in the wilderness, if you will. At the time, I guess they felt they were voices in the wilderness. Sort of this angry, strident, reaction to things that were going on in the world, and particularly with Rush Limbaugh, this sort of aggressive, attacking approach that really we hadn't heard before. Attacks that were personal in a way, particularly against people like, at the time, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, whom Rush Limbaugh hated with a passion. And anyway, this spawned a huge number of talk show hosts who would spew the most angry, vile, hateful kinds of things. And that sparked, and it became very popular because people were listening. Perhaps for varying reasons. For some, I'm sure it was an outlet. For others, I think they were just galvanized by the button-pushing, angry approach that it took. And for others, it was just a rather bizarre form of entertainment that, to my mind, is sort of paralleled with kind of watching in fascination as a train wreck happens. Just to listen to these people spout very angry, hateful and some of the approaches are different. And now that we have a Republican in the White House and Republicans in control, but they're still they're who are we kidding? There still is a lot. In any case, then there was a reaction to these conservative talk show hosts on the liberal side. So then you began to have liberal talk show hosts who decided that they were going to take the same approach, the same strident attacking approach, although only the only difference being that they were going to take the other side of the argument. So, for instance, in the early years after 9/11, in the Bush years, you had the rise of a network called Air America, where you had that was the game plan. These talk show hosts were going to have the same kind of approach that the conservatives had, only they were going to be liberals. And so airwaves just clogged up with strident, angry voices talking about the day's news, framing it in the way they wanted to frame it, whether it be conservative over there, liberal over there, Christian over here, and that's what we have today. It's, culminating in what we see on places like Fox News. And so I thought to myself years ago, how about we do a talk show that looks at the news from another perspective, a higher perspective, and gives it a higher spin, a spin from a spiritual perspective, if you will, a spin from a metaphysical perspective. And if you've been listening to the show, you know how I approach those things from the perspective of all of these things that we're reacting to, dealing with in the world, are illusions that we have created at a much higher level for us to get involved with, to experience in a way that at our highest level we can never experience. Because see, that's why we're here. We're here to, sort of embrace it all and take it in and understand that we are creating it all. I've always likened it to virtual reality games, or holograms, if you will, that are created with certain programs, certain limitations. You take on an avatar, which is your, circumstances around you, whether they relationships are, and then you are launched into the game and given a set of circumstances and a set of varying set of problems to solve, influences, all of those things. And by participating in this, we understand uh, the truth of who and what we really are, which goes beyond the physical game, if you will. So, oh, look at the clock. I've spent 10 minutes explaining what the show is about. That always happens to me. I get off the track in the explanation side of things, but I feel like often it's important for people to understand what I'm talking about. So we've been discussing our last week's show. We talked about changing minds. And in particular, we talked about, we started by talking about how you might influence someone to change their mind about something, and is that possible? And even if it is possible, does it work? And then we started talking about how you change your mind, because as all spiritual seekers know, or come to find out eventually, all change starts within. Since everything in the outer starts within, any change has to start within too. And so we've been talking about the return of, if you will, the use of sacraments, such as psilocybin, which you might know as magic mushrooms, and lysergic acid, LSD, and how these things have returned in a therapeutic way to help with a variety of modern day illnesses that we are dealing with, and how these sacraments, these they're chemicals, but they also are they have their roots in plants. Well, no pun intended, but they come from plants, and these are the same kinds of plants that shamans used to access higher realms. Their origins go back to the knowledge of these shamans with hallucinogenic plants, and they performed these rituals, which would create states of mind in which you could have mystical experiences that could change you. So these things came to the Western world in around the 1950s through a company called Sandoz Laboratory, as they were beginning to do research on these psychedelic drugs and how they might be used to help people with difficult illnesses, including alcoholics and others, people with autism and terminal illnesses, and of course, famously, Mr. Timothy Leary began to do experiments at Harvard on how these psychedelic therapies changed people's attitudes and their minds. And going back to the ancient times of shaman and medicine men, where they used these psychedelics to gain access to the spirit world, and they knew naturally where these psychedelics